Welcome to the Blackhawks Breakaway Podcast on CHSN with Charlie Roumeliotis. I am Pat Boyle. We are brought to you by Toyota. Toyota has more all-wheel drive and four-wheel drive vehicles than any other brand. Find yours and shine on. Toyota, let's go places. How you doing today, Charlie?
It's good. How was your Thanksgiving?
Good. We had family over to the house and had a great meal. Kind of wedged in between a lot of Blackhawks hockey. So got my hockey talk, got my football talk, and then the Bears cleaned house on Friday, as we expected.
Yep, as we did expect. I was watching that Thursday game at the end of right before we sat down to eat for our family, and there were a lot of upset people in our family after watching that Bears finish. So, but I'm sure a lot of those Bears fans are excited after they cleaned house the other day.
All right, well, let's get to the team that we cover on a daily basis, the Chicago Blackhawks. They lost their third in a row last night in Toronto, and this happened after starting off pre-Thanksgiving, Thanksgiving Eve, with a big win over Dallas, 6-2 at the United Center. And just give you some little snapshots, headlines from each of these games since our last podcast. In the Dallas game, Bedard ended a 12-game goal drought, and Taylor Hall had his first hat trick since 2013. On Black Friday, the Blackhawks let a 2-goal lead slip away. The Wild won that game 3-2. On Sunday, the Hawks scored 3 power play goals, but lost 6-3 to Columbus. Columbus scored 3 of their goals within a minute to 3 minutes after all 3 Blackhawks tallies. And then last night at Scotiabank Arena in downtown Toronto, the Hawks lost to the Leafs 4-1. The final score doesn't indicate kind of how that game really looked. If you watched it, the decisive edge and shot attempts, 60-37 for the Blackhawks in the game, including 33-7 in the second period. So that's kind of what's gone on here over the last 4 games, a 3-game losing skid. Where do you want to begin, Charlie?
Yeah, we'll start near the beginning. And I actually kind of want to rewind before the Dallas game to kind of summarize the last 7 games, because it feels like if you rewind back to the Anaheim game where the Hawks had a 2-1 lead going into the third period, ended up blowing that game, lost in regulation 3-2. They beat the defending Stanley Cup champion Florida Panthers 3-1. The next day, or 2 days later, they take a 2-0 lead in Philadelphia into the third period, lose that game 3-2 in overtime. We know what happened in the Dallas game. Taylor Hall hat trick. Connor Bedard is off the schneid. Big 6-2 win. And then with Minnesota, they're up 2-0 going into the third period, and they blow that lead. And so you could theoretically look at those last 7 games. Like the Hawks very easily could have won 5 games in a row between Anaheim, Florida, Philadelphia, Dallas, Minnesota. And now we're looking at a 3-game losing streak in regulation and just 2 wins over their last, I think it's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's like over their last 10 games. So it's like, man, the Hawks had an opportunity to string together 3, 4, 5 wins in a row, and now they're looking at another 3-game losing streak in regulation. It was weird that how they lost against Toronto, because I thought it was one of their best efforts of the season. I mean, you hold Toronto to 37 shot attempts. You should win that hockey game. And again, that score of 4-1 looks a little lopsided. It did not feel like it. If you replay that game 10 times, I think the Hawks probably win that game 7 or 8 times. And so it's unfortunate result. It was like they got Anthony Stolarz, who was excellent in the game, but just a disappointing last couple weeks, because I felt like the Hawks easily could have won 5 games in a row, and now they had only 2 wins in their last 8 or 9 games.
They still are really struggling to score 5-on-5. Their only real offense comes off the power play, which, credit the power play. It's been in the upper third all season long, and it's been really good as of late. It didn't capitalize in Toronto. That's probably what led to their demise. The 28-second 5-on-3 where they got some really quality looks, they weren't able to cash in there. What is it about this team 5-on-5 that they just can't get it going offensively?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you would hope that some of the power play success would translate over to some confidence at 5-on-5, and it just hasn't. The Hawks did have that 5-game stretch where they had just one power play in 5 consecutive games, and I think the first of those 5 games, it was like a 26-second power play, so you can't even count it. And so you kind of understood the 5-on-5 struggles in those games because they just weren't getting any power play time. But it's a little weird that against Dallas against Columbus they score 3 power play goals and they just weren't able to score anything at even strength. And I think part of it is, they have, I think, a combination. The top guys weren't producing at the time. It was Teuvo Teravainen, Taylor Hall, Connor Bedard, Tyler Bertuzzi. All 4 of those players were struggling at the same time. Now that after that Dallas game, I thought, okay, this might free all of them up offensively, and we just haven't seen that. So I just think it's the Blackhawks trying to get to those dirty areas and try not to score goals the pretty way. Because that feels like the Blackhawks try to do it in a pretty type way, and I just think you got to score gritty. And I don't know if they have a lot of those players that want to play that gritty type style.
Yeah, and I think that's probably why Ryan Donato's the guy that's leading this team in goals, right? He is that gritty type. His goals are not necessarily pretty. He got some decent looks in Toronto. There's just not enough of those second chance opportunities, a lot of one and dones with this team, not enough traffic, not enough guys that play inside the dots on a regular basis. Let's talk about some of the line construction. It was nice to see, first of all, it was awesome to see Connor score against Dallas and, look to the rafters, and you could feel the weight being lifted off his shoulders. And then it translated the next 3 games. He played probably his best 3 games in a row in a long time, and he had 4 points over those 3 games. So it was excellent to see him get back on track. I know it didn't translate in Toronto. No shots on goal. I believe 3 shot attempts. Your thoughts on what you saw from Bedard over this last stretch? And they tried Bertuzzi on his line in Toronto with Taylor Hall. Your thoughts on what you saw from that line? Yeah,
Connor Bedard specifically, just watching him. Well, because I do radio now post game, I'm not able to be in the post game scrums at the United Center. So just watching the video afterwards, you could just see how relieved he looked, both in his voice and smiling. And of course, it came in a win too, and that is the most important thing to him. But I think the fact that he was able to contribute and get off the schneid in the win, I think you can. I mean, you said it. The goal celebration after he scored. I mean, he just looked straight at the heavens and it's kind of just like. He smiled at the guys that were on the ice with him, so you knew that lifted him in a significant way. And for him to roll that into the Minnesota game, I know he was awesome against Minnesota, just generating scoring chances seemingly every third shift. So it was nice to see him feeling back like himself again. I don't read too much into the Toronto game. I know he had 0 shots on goal, but it still looked like he flashed, and it wasn't like he was playing timid out there. It was more so just, Toronto is a very good hockey team, and they do play stingy defensively now under Craig Berube. And so, yeah, and then with the Taylor Hall, I think the interesting part is we finally got, 3 games in a row where Luke Richardson kept the lines the same, where it was Hall and Bedard together. And I think that was maybe part of the reason why maybe they were able to develop some chemistry and there wasn't a quick line change after, because because the Hawks were able to turn in a really good performance against the Dallas Stars. So I'm sure that factored into the equation too, that rolled over into the next couple games.
So with that being said, what is the right line for him? I think we both would agree that Kurashev and Tavo are the two that have shown the most chemistry with Connor over the last year and a half, right?
Yep.
So I would think one of those guys has to be on the line. I mean, if we're trying to get this engine going here, that seemingly I'd start with at least one of those two. And I know they're trying to, kind of shoehorn Kurashev into this center role. Do you think it's probably in Kurashev's best interest, probably to go to wing? Like that's probably where he's going to be most effective, and they need to find a different solution for the second line center.
For sure. And I feel like if you're Chicago, you're probably just buying time until Frank Nazar gets the call up, whenever that is. And I did like, it was the Dallas game that Philip Kurashev finally played on the right side with Connor Bedard and not on the left. And so it was funny that line ends up scoring 17 seconds into the game. Kurashev gets the primary assist on Taylor Hall's goal. So I like, if Kurashev is going to play on a line with Connor Bedard, I think you have to have him on the right side, not the left, because that's just where they created the most chemistry last season. So if you put a Teuvo Teravainen back on that line, I think you move him to the left side and keep Kurashev to the right, because Teravainen does have experience playing both left and right, but clearly Kurashev is the most comfortable playing on the right, because that's where he performed the best with Connor Bedard last season. So if you go to that trio, I would put Teravainen to the left, Kurashev to the right, but I wouldn't mind keeping Taylor Hall on Connor Bedard's left side and just put Kurashev back on the right, because just try to feed off the chemistry that they had against Dallas, where Hall gets the hat trick and Bedard gets off the schneid. It's like that was the game where they both felt most like themselves. So I would kind of let them try to bottle that chemistry that they had in the Dallas game and carry it into whatever moving forward.
This void of second line center has really been the crux of the line construction issues all season, right? It's amazing how one slot, if you don't have it, like again, they thought maybe Nazar would grab it in the preseason. I still think that was a long shot at best. And he's been just tearing it up at the AHL level. And I think he's going to continue to trend in an upward direction. And I think you'll see him in Chicago with the Blackhawks, maybe January-ish, maybe late January or early February at the latest. Well, what would be your timeline to seeing Frank Nazar back with the Blackhawks?
Yeah, I would say post-holiday, so post-New Year's into January. I think you want to see him. I think he's played in 21-ish games with Rockford, so it's he's 20 games away from reaching the 40-game mark, which is the season that he's used to playing at Michigan in college. Right. And so you kind of want to see him go through the entire first half of the season with Rockford. Having said that, if he performs, like I know the Hawks have that, they have the Winter Classic game on December 31st. Like, I don't know if it would be an exciting time to call him up and get fans excited, but I would caution doing it for that reason, because I think when you do call up Frank Nazar, you want him to be there for good. You don't want him to go through a stretch where he's not producing or he's not getting the same amount of puck touches that he's getting in Rockford. And then you find yourself in a position where you're like, he might benefit a little bit more time from Rockford. Let's send him back down. And then it's kind of this bigger story that he was called up, then he had to go back down. So I would say if in a perfect world, I would say closer to the end of January, early February, and give him the final 2 months of the season with the Blackhawks.
In a perfect world, you don't want him feeling the added pressure of being the savior to the 5-on-5 offensive woes. You know, you don't want him like, oh, we're calling you up, and oh, by the way, we are 30th in 5-on-5 goals. Now that you're our second line center, all things are cured. Like, you know, that's not a recipe for success. The other thing, I think the Winter Classic has enough pomp and circumstance attached to it. It's a different game. Ice surface is not as good as normally, you know, United Center ice or any other indoor building would be. You've got different sight lines. You've got who knows what kind of conditions we're going to have. I'd either want him up prior to that where he got a few games under his belt or after it. I don't want him like as the the cherry on the top to the Winter Classic. I think that would be for his reemergence in the lineup, I think that'd be just a little too much.
Yeah, I totally agree. If he is called up before the Winter Classic, you have to give him a few games to get situated with his teammates and potential line mates that he's going to be playing with. But I would be a little surprised if he gets called up before December 31st. Like, the only way I can see that happening is if he just continues to blow the doors off the minors and he is just begging the Blackhawks to call him up, where it's like, okay, we just have no choice but to bring this guy up because he feels 100% ready. But I would just make sure that he over ripens in Rockford. Remember that a few years ago. This is a poor example because the organization was in a different position, but it was Adam Boquist when he got drafted by Chicago. I remember asking him in Dallas, we were like, hey, how far away do you think you are from the NHL? And he's like, at least 2 or 3 years away. Then he goes to junior, plays one more year in junior, then turns pro. And a month into the season, I think less than a month into the season, the Hawks had a really tough start, and they called him up in Anaheim, I believe. They were on the West Coast. And Boquist was like, I was a little surprised that I got the call. I wasn't really playing well in Rockford. And it was like the Hawks needed to sell hope, and they needed some offensive jump from the back end. And it was like they called him up way too early. And again, it's not apples to apples because Frank Nazar is showing that he is close to NHL ready, and Boquist was far younger and just needed way more time to develop. But it's to your point of you don't want to call this guy up because the Blackhawks are struggling and you need help scoring goals. Like, you should call Frank Nazar up when he is 100% ready to be a full-time NHL player.
And I think that's where Kyle Davidson and Norm McIver, they saw that, how that went with Stan, the bringing guys up too quickly, and how that didn't suit the player well, didn't suit the team well. And even you could look at Kirby Dach and other cases as well. I think that's why that's been Kyle's mantra, to over-ripen at the AHL level. I'd rather bring a guy up later than way too soon.
For sure. And to defend Stan Bowman to some degree is the organization was in a different position back then too, where when they had Adam Boquist and Kirby Dach, like it was almost like, I remember the Kirby Dach situation specifically is the Hawks that was the year that I think they signed Robin Lehner and they acquired Calvin DeHaan. Like they were going for it. And so if you sent him back to junior, going for it from the standpoint,
going for it.
Yeah. Yeah, you don't make those offseason moves. You bring back Andrew Shaw. You sign Robin Lehner. The previous year, the previous couple years, they were like, ugh. And so with the Kirby Dach situation, I think they were like, if we send him back to junior, we're sending a poor message to our locker room that it's like, well, he could help us be a top 9 forward. And so it got a little dicey there, but the point remains the same, where the Hawks are in no rush to get these guys to the NHL. Like, they have to take every situation on a situational basis, and just look at Frank Nazar's situation and say, we're not going to pressure this guy into bringing him up too soon because Chicago is having trouble scoring at 5-on-5. Like, make sure that he's 100% ready. You see enough from him in Rockford where you feel good enough that when you do call him up, even if he goes through a little bit of a struggle in the NHL, like, he's here for good, and they're not flirting with potentially sending him back down.
All right, we've seen there's a trend, and we saw it a bit last year, or maybe quite a bit last year. We've seen it smattered throughout this season as well. When the Hawks score, the opposition scoring in short order. Now, there's the examples of them scoring on the next shift, and then there's the example like we saw in the what game was it where they had the
Columbus.
three?
Yeah,
I guess was it the Columbus game? Columbus game, where they scored all three Blackhawks goals. Columbus scored a minute to 3 minutes after that. I want to use the example of the Wild game, and they were up 2-0 in that game midway through the second period, and they are kind of feeling themselves a little bit, and they're going to go for the dagger. A 3-0 lead midway through a game, pretty good chances you're going to pull that one out. And Taylor Hall makes a pass that was dicey at best, and it's picked off, counter the Wild. They score, bit of an odd man rush, and then they keep the same line out there, Bedard, Hall, and at that time, I think it was probably Khrushchev on that line.
Yep, it was.
And they lose the draw. They had an opportunity to break out. They missed the pass. I think Vlasic missed the outlet pass, and then they ended up scoring. Spurgeon scored to equalize the game at 2-2 in a matter of seconds. What do you make? Because not all examples are the same, but we even saw it in the Toronto game, the quick responses after a goal. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I feel like, so we've seen it 3 games in a row now, like you mentioned, Minnesota, Columbus, and Toronto. And prior to the Minnesota game, I can't remember a notable example where that was a theme for the Blackhawks, at least this season. Feels like last year there were an array of examples where it was either after the Blackhawks scored a goal to kind of pull within striking distance, and then it was like, demoralizing goal right after by the opponent, or it was the opponent scoring a goal, and then it was them capitalizing on that immediately after and scoring 2 goals in a minute span. And you're thinking, oh, wow, that was 2 quick strikes by the opponent. They were able to capitalize on their momentum quickly, and the Hawks weren't able to reset. So prior to the Minnesota game this year, I didn't really feel like that was an area that was troubling the Blackhawks. I think for me is there's got to be a little bit more attention to detail and just awareness of the situation. Like the Minnesota game specifically, and I hate to pile on Taylor Hall here, but it's like if that one little mistake doesn't happen, then the second goal doesn't happen, right? So it's almost like just try to nip it before it even gets to a point where you allow. And to be fair, that second goal, the second goal in 17 seconds was so fluky, like went off Connor Murphy and in. But it was like, that's just an example of how quickly things can snowball if you aren't careful and really focused on the attention to detail. So like in the Taylor Hall situation, just kind of like drive that to the net or just chip it in and just make it a less risky play versus the one that
here's what I would do. And again, I'll Luke Richardson will forget more hockey today than I'll ever know. Like in that case, if a veteran like Hall makes that kind of mistake, I probably take that line off, even though it's Connor Bedard's line. I probably and we saw it last night. I mean, I like the Dickinson line after we score, because I've got probably the best opportunity to win the draw, and I want to make sure that we keep momentum going. And so after Hall makes the turnover that lead gets kind of the Wild going, and they hadn't had much going to note of at that point. If that mistake is made and it's clear, unfortunately I'm punishing or whatever. I'm taking ice time away from the player that made the mistake, and unfortunately his line mates have to go with him, and I'm putting a more reliable defensive. And maybe that's a timid way to look at it, or an ultra conservative way, but on this team, I think you kind of you have to, because the 5-on-5 is where you're struggling the most.
Yeah, no, I think that's more than a fair point. I would have to go back and look at that situation specifically, because I'm not sure who took the shift prior. So maybe his intention was to want to get out the Dickinson line or whatever. But maybe they were tired coming off the previous shift. But I mean, you just look at the Toronto game yesterday. It was the start of the second period and the start of the third period. I think Jason Dickinson's line started, and they turned in a really good shift right out of the gate. And so it feels like that line could be the stabilizing line of, if it's a goal against or a goal for, throw that line out to make sure that they're turning in a really strong shift. And I would even throw out the fourth line too.
Charlie, they've been the most consistent line the last 2 to 3 weeks. First of all, it's been the most consistent line constructed. Maroon, Reichel, and Smith, they've actually played together, but it's for good reason. They're generating scoring opportunities. They're playing responsible at both ends of the ice. Maroon and Smith have been better than advertised. I would have thought in the back end of a back-to-back, that's where you would have seen the two mid-30-year-olds struggle. And even though Reichel scored last night, I thought he was the weakest link of the three in the back end of a back-to-back.
Right. And I even think of the Philly game. I know that was the line that scored both of the goals in Philadelphia. But not only that, I remember Philadelphia was making a little bit of a push in the second period. I think mid-second period, they turned in some consecutive shifts in a row where the Flyers were starting to tilt the ice in their favor. Then Luke throws out the fourth line with Reichel, Maroon, and Smith, and it was a really good shift. It went to a TV timeout, and right out of that TV timeout, Luke stayed with that fourth line, and that they turned in another really good shift, and it kind of helped stabilize the Flyers tilting the ice in their favor. So I'm totally with you. Maybe it's one of those things where I could see where it's after a Chicago goal, if you want to keep the offensive players out there to want to try to build on that immediately after. But in a situation where it's a goal against, I think throwing out the Dickinson or the fourth line wouldn't be the worst decision, because you want to make sure that shift after a goal against is one that the Blackhawks are prepared for.
And we're about accountability, right? Like, I don't need to wait to healthy scratch someone the next game. Like, if someone makes a costly turnover, like let's have accountability, in game on that one. Let's talk about this power play. We touched on it a little bit. They had the 3 consecutive games where they scored a power play goal going into the Toronto game. They were 6 for 13 over that span. So ridiculous, 46%. They did have, like you said, those 5 games prior to the stretch where they only had 1 power play attempt in each game, which is a franchise record. And I don't think it had been done in the NHL since 2019 or something. What is surprising to me about the success of this power play is that they're doing it with a quarterback in Alex Vlasic who's kind of learning on the fly. This has not been a spot that he has been in throughout his hockey career. And, I give them credit. I give him credit for kind of learning on the fly. And we're starting to see him get some shots through. Yeah, there's some setup problems that they have as far as entering the zone and setting up the power play. And they would probably benefit from someone who has done it for a longer period of time. But with Alex Vlasic kind of learning on the go here, it has been impressive to me, with Seth Jones being out, how productive that power play has been.
Yeah, you mentioned it. Without Seth Jones, it's basically been next man up mentality. And it's like Alec Martinez quarterback in the second unit. And that's probably not an area that, I mean, he's done that in the past, but I don't think the Blackhawks were hoping to utilize him in that way to overexert a veteran that has a lot of mileage on his NHL body and has won 3 Stanley Cups in this league. So you add on the postseason games that he's played in. But yeah, Alex Vlasic has been terrific. And I also want to point out, was it the Columbus game or Dallas, where he basically led the rush himself, went end to end, generated a scoring chance on the power play, and it was like, man, when he can go end to end and he's got the long legs, the powerful stride. It's like when I saw that, it crossed my mind where I'm like, oh, 4 Nations tournament, you got to submit the rosters by today. And they're going to be announced on Wednesday. And I'm like, man, he's not going to make the team for Team USA, but boy, he has absolutely played himself on the radar for the 2026 Olympics for Team USA, because that guy, he can shut down defense, or he can be a shutdown type defenseman as good as any in the NHL as far as a young player like him. But man, he also has some offensive upside that when he wants to be and when he has that mentality to attack, he can do it.
Yeah, and you bring up the 4 Nations. I could see a scenario, like when you look at all the different mock lineups, the Team USA back end is very offensive defenseman oriented. And if they feel like they have maybe too many offensive-minded defensemen and need more of a defensive presence, I think that's where his stock is so important and rising, because he gives you that shutdown factor, that long reach, but he also can give you some of that offensive upside. So if there is an injury between Wednesday's announcement and the week or so before it starts in February, there could be an opportunity that Alex gets an invite to Team USA. And I guess you're probably thinking that Bedard's on the outside looking into for Team Canada. And I don't know how far outside he is of the picture, but let's say, they name 13 forwards. He's not among them. If there is an injury or two between now and the start in mid-February, would you think, and I guess it would also be if Connor starts to heat up here, could you see him being a late add because of injury?
Yeah, I know Mark Stone has been out of the lineup for 12 games, or he's going to miss his 13th game today, but he's probably going to be on the roster if he's healthy, right? And so I think it's going to be one of those situations where Stone's on the roster, but if he's not healthy, then they'll kind of substitute him for someone else. And so I could see a scenario where, because it is weird that the tournament is in mid-February. I mean, that's 3 months between now and February, where if Connor starts to get hot, it's weird that they're like, oh, we already made our decision 3 months ago. And I think that one of the reasons why they did it so early is because players wanted to the players wanted to be able to plan for what their February is going to look like, because you got vacations, you got, stuff like that, which I know sounds silly. But I know that the Players Association probably wanted a little bit of a longer heads up in that department. So we'll see what happens between now and February and how the roster shakes out as far as injuries go. But with Bedard, if he gets hot, I think that's going to be an interesting decision if there is an injury or two up front for Team Canada. And with Alex Vlasic, you make a great point where I know Team USA, they have a lot of offensive defensemen on their team. But in a tournament like that, where you need versatility from guys, Vlasic can absolutely slide into that shutdown type role on a third pairing for Team USA. But if you have an injury or something within the game, he can also be on a pairing that can help drive some offense and not just be kind of a liability in that department.
And he can play all minutes, right? He can play on your PK. Obviously he wouldn't play power play minutes on Team USA. The other thing too is kind of like, what does this tournament represent? And it's it's put on by the NHL, and it's replacing the All-Star game. And we know the All-Star game is to promote the game of hockey. Obviously, this Four Nations is a form of that. How much of it is it to, bolster people like Connor Bedard, who, sells among the most jerseys in the National Hockey League, and you get to see him on that stage. We've already seen him in World Juniors dominate. How great would it be for Blackhawks fans to see him, with other like-minded players who see the game the way he does, and see if indeed, with more talent around him, that brings his talent to the forefront even more. I get the impression that it's a little bit of both, right? It's about promoting the game, but at the end of the day, Team Canada wants to take down Team USA and vice versa. And Finland and Sweden want to be in on the mix as well. So they're not showing up for this is skills competition night before the All-Star game, and everyone's mic'd up and fist bumping each other. I think you're going to see in this tournament, again, and there's not a bunch of games leading up. There's 3 games, and then there's the title game. If this was like the Olympics or the World Championships where there's prelim rounds, maybe you could make a case where you could bring a younger player along that maybe didn't have all the credentials to be on the team right now because of what they've done or haven't done, but because they're going to be the captain of the future, or they're going to be, a major cog in either Team USA or Team Canada down the road.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance because this is an NHL and NHLPA event. They were the two that agreed to it. So it's very clearly trying to market the NHL and the league itself. Having said that, if you're Doug Armstrong running Team Canada and you're running into a situation where you're wrestling between Bedard and Steven Stamkos for your 13th forward, and you know that John Cooper is the head coach and Braden Point is on the team in that tournament, John Cooper and Team Canada will probably favor Steven Stamkos because he knows that I can put Stamkos with Braden Point and they have that instant chemistry, right? And I also think an interesting wrinkle to this situation, and maybe this, I don't know how much this is going to play into it, but the Olympics are in 2026. It's if that's a priority to the countries, do you try to put Connor Bedard as the 13th forward to let him get that experience before being on the team in 2026 because the Olympics is more important than this Four Nations tournament? I'm not sure. It feels like it is kind of they're going to try to encapsulate all of this, but I think in the very end, it's going to be prioritizing winning this hockey tournament versus making sure that I think pumping the brand is kind of the hope, the secondary hope of what they hope to be a really good tournament between these 4 teams.
Well, I think it would be awesome for him to get the invite, whether it's because of injury or whatever reason. I just think I would like to see him on that stage. So let's quickly wrap things up here. The Laurent Brossoit injury update, 6 more weeks, and then he'll be evaluated. Had another procedure on the knee. You had the meniscus cleanup back in August. So Arvid Söderblom will get more run. I think we're 3 games away from him reaching 60, which means he would then have to pass through waivers before going back to the AHL. We've discussed on this podcast with the way he's playing, being 25, and his price tag, he probably would not make it through waivers. So the Brossoit injury does add another wrinkle to, or the setback adds another wrinkle to the Söderblom situation.
Yeah, I do feel in some ways, though, it would have been more of a concern if Brossoit was getting ready to return soon, because then you're like, wow, well, Söderblom's playing very well. Now we're in a situation where we have 3 goalies, but the fact that Brossoit, it's not just, at least you mentioned it perfectly, that the clarification by the Blackhawks PR was he's going to be reevaluated in 6 weeks. So it's not just 6 weeks until he's ready to return. So it's reevaluated in 6 weeks. Then he's going to need probably at least 2 weeks of just skating on his own to make sure. And then probably another couple weeks at least to get in some practices. So it's like
now we're at 10 best case scenario from now.
Yeah. So we might even be talking about in February. And by that point, if it becomes, February, just kind of spitballing here, then you're like, they can kind of go through the final couple months of the season just running 3 goaltenders, because at that point, Söderblom has gotten enough games in where you feel okay that if they just kind of have to rotate. And so, and who knows, you also have injuries that you deal with. I remember a few years ago, the Hawks had like Jeff Glass and Anton Fort. I mean, there was like a crazy amount of injuries to their goaltending situation. So you just never know what's going to happen between now and then.
You also have the trade deadline. I mean, if you have a surplus of goalies, again, I'm not looking at Brossoit as being, if for some reason he goes down and does some rehab assignments in Rockford and he looks good and it does give you the opportunity to think about, okay, does Mrazek want to stay here till the end of the contract? Would he like to go somewhere else? Or, do you move Söderblom?
Right. Yeah. And it's definitely going to be a conversation. I would be surprised if this was the deadline where Mrazek is potentially dealt. I think next year is probably closer to, because then you can it gets you to the next stage of the rebuild where you're like, okay, if we need to move him for the final couple months of the season, we can get by. But yeah, it's going to be an option for sure. So I think Söderblom, it's going to be a slam dunk that he's going to hit 60 games, barring some unforeseen circumstances. And I think the Blackhawks probably would have been a little bit more worried about, what do we do in this situation if Brossoit was ready to return like now? Because then it's like, this is too long of a rope between now and the end of the regular season to figure out how they're going to handle a 3 goalie situation. But if Brossoit doesn't return until closer to February, I think it's more manageable in the last couple months of the season.
Hawks back in action Wednesday, another Original Six matchup, Boston Bruins. It's a 6:30 puck drop, so we'll have pregame at 6 o'clock. It's on both CHSN and outside of the Chicago market, it is on TNT. Any other parting shots you have as we exit?
No, but I shared this on the postgame show yesterday. We are in a stretch of 8 games in a row where we got 6:30 or earlier puck drops. This is incredible stretch. Wednesday is going to be game 3 of 8.
All right. Well, I like to hear that. So that is going to do it for the Blackhawks Breakaway Podcast for CHSN, presented by Toyota. Toyota, let's go places. For Charlie Roumeliotis, I'm Pat Boyle. Thank you for listening and watching, and we'll catch you next time.